John Dryden's chorus in the play The Secular Masque, performed at the turn of the century in the year 1700, goes like this. Thy wars brought nothing about, thy lovers were all untrue. 'Tis well in old age is out, and time to begin anew. And in terms of poetry and culture, the Augustan Age, which begins with the return of King Charles II, and rather the return of the monarchy, it truly was a time of new beginnings. Looking back, last week we explored early 17th century poetry. We looked primarily at the metaphysical style, but we also considered the Puritan and Cavalier styles. But this poetry, especially the metaphysical poets, or rather the metaphysical style, tended to prefer the abstract, the idiosyncratic, the unusual, the various, the unexpected. Augustan Age poetry, beginning with the return of Charles II, prioritized the reasonable, the material, the empirical, the sane. Their interests are in stability, order, and what is rational. So welcome everyone to our lecture on the Augustan Age in the 18th century poets. I'm joined over Zoom by my Patreon supporters who are supporting my public humanities work here. So thanks to them for making this series possible for you. And we'll meet after this lecture for conversation and Q&A. And if you on YouTube would like to join us and to support my work in making the study of poetry accessible to all outside the university, you can find more information on Patreon through the link below. In this lecture, I'll survey the wide and prolific poetry of the Restoration, often called England's Augustan Age poetry. I'll focus on John Dryden and Alexander Pope in the first half primarily. And then I want to turn our attention to the 18th century, mid-18th century, and what is often called the Age of Johnson, the Age of Samuel Johnson. It's going to be the second half. The 18th century is often neglected, both by academics and by readers. It's a seemingly forbidding domain of poetry, full of satire, erudite and compact verse, and neoclassical reference. But in this lecture, I aim at making this period of poetry accessible to anyone who's not familiar with it. So if you want to appreciate, or at least to learn about, the poetry of the 18th century, what do you need to know? Well, first of all, one must recognize that poetry changed during the late 17th century. The love poem becomes scarce. The sonnet virtually disappears for about 100 years, only to be revived at the end of the 18th century by poets such as Charlotte Smith and William Lyle Bowles. Poetry adopts a largely social role, distancing itself from the passionate strains of the Petrarchan love poems and the inharmonious concourse of metaphysical poetry. Rejected in this period, too, are the personal strains of devotion that so characterized religious poets such as George Herbert and Henry Vaughan. We won't get into the devotional verse of the 18th century, but during this time, there was a preference for the communal. This is when some of the greatest hymn writers, such as Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley, lived and wrote. But you don't see much of the personal, private devotional experience. Also, formally, lyrical experimentation is gone. That gives way to tried and true forms of classical poetry. Playfulness and passion are exchanged for correctness and aesthetic restraint. What is to account for all of this change? Partly the civil wars from 1642 to 1651, in which the largely Puritan parliamentary faction overthrew King Charles I's royalist army. They captured the king, they put him on trial, charged him with tyranny and treason against the nation, and he was publicly beheaded. And what followed was an 11-year parliamentary reign, basically governed by the Lord Protectorate Oliver Cromwell. Now, when Cromwell died in the autumn of 1658, his son was appointed in his stead, but he only ruled for 9 months. The country was floundering and eventually decided to call forth the exiled son of Charles I back to England from the continent. So on the 8th of May, 1660, England proclaimed that Charles II had been the lawful monarch the whole time. And Charles returned from exile, landed at Dover on May 25th, and the monarchy was thus restored. During this period, religious disputes are quieted, or at least kept at a distance from polite society. Manners, not zeal, is the new piety. And it's interesting reading the sermons from this period. I took an interest in sermons a couple years ago from the 17th century, and the sermons before the Restoration, very different from the sermons after the Restoration. The sermons, they turn from this explicitly Christian theme, scriptural expositional method of preaching, to a focus on morals and manners through a more topical method. There's something interesting. So John Dryden's Religio Laici talks a little bit about this change from, excuse me, let me let Adriana in. This change in both piety and culture. Let me read you an excerpt from that beautiful example of Dryden's way of writing. But notice what he's prioritizing here. "'Tis some relief that points not clearly known, without much hazard may be let alone. And after hearing what our church can say, if still our reason runs another way, that private reason 'tis more just to curb, than by disputes the public peace disturb. For points obscure, or of small use to learn, what common quiet is mankind's concern. Private revelations eschewed here for doctrinal consensus. What our church, that would be the Church of England, which was restored with the monarchy, can say. Points obscure and points not clearly known. This is a reference to questions about church governance, baptism, eschatology. Eschatology was concerned with the end of the world and the return of Christ. All of these things were the sort of questions that are not clear in the Christian Bible and require a lot of extrapolation and reasoning. But these are the questions, these were the kinds of questions fueling public disturbance and even civil war. Scripture was not clear on any of these points. And so Dryden is saying, what is not clear, we should let alone, keep to our own private selves and our own opinions to maintain societal peace. But these, let's look formally at this line. These are neat lines, aren't they? Here's one period, here's another. See how ordered and neat they are? These are called heroic couplets, where a pair of rhyming iambic pentameters, much like we saw Chaucer use in the general prologue, and it becomes a mode that's very popular in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially with figures like John Dryden and Alexander Pope. It's steady, it's rhythmic. There is none of this metaphysical shock. They're not trying to catch us or lead us toward an argument like John Donne will often do in his lyrics. This is the surprise. When it does surprise, it is the surprise of wit, common quiet, public peace. These are the concerns of this poem. The 18th century poets, including John Dryden here, who's more of a late 17th century poet, they aim for what is general and universal rather than the particular and the unique. And in this respect, they differ considerably from their predecessors. They take what is most sensible of the Cavaliers' style. I think we see the Cavaliers living on in many of the Augustan Age poets. But they refine it into a more polite and neoclassical mode. In fact, John Dryden looked back to the poet Edmund Waller as his most worthy predecessor, and in some respects improved English letters far more than Waller had, and that's something that John Dryden did. T.S. Eliot said, actually, that it's hardly too much to say that Dryden found the English speechless, and he gave them speech. And he's echoing also what Samuel Johnson writes in his Life of Dryden. Now, I want to talk about the social role of poetry during this time, because this is key if we're going to understand what a poet is during the Augustan Age. And I want to show you John Dryden's Macflecknoe. Macflecknoe is a verse mock heroic satire written by John Dryden. Satire is in this case, a lampoon, making fun of, in this case, another poet. It's a direct attack on Thomas Shadwell, another prominent poet at this time. The feud between Thomas Shadwell and John Dryden began in the late 1660s and lasted for over a decade. The immediate occasion of this poem, Macflecknoe, is not known. We don't know what exactly might have provoked Dryden into this attack. But this lampoon was written in 1678, probably for private circulation among friends as a joke, but it wasn't published until 1682. Let's pull that up. Dryden's Macflecknoe cleverly mocks Shadwell by portraying him as the dull heir to a poetic kingdom ruled by the forgettable Richard Flecknoe, who was a poet in the late 17th century that Andrew Marvell makes fun of. He's not a great poet, and in this poem, Richard Flecknoe is imagined to be choosing an heir for his ridiculous kingdom of poetry. So Dryden employs this mock heroic style, which means that he uses grand language like an epic poem to describe something not impressive. In this case, Shadwell's terrible poetry. Notice how this begins in this elevated mode. All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. This Flecknoe found, who, like Augustus, young was called to empire, and had governed long. In prose and verse was owned without dispute through all the realms of nonsense, absolute. So the poem opens with this epic tone, the scope, all things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. Flecknoe, this monarch who rules over the realms of nonsense, absolute, is now looking for his next heir, and Shadwell is being called to rule over this empire, now that he's growing old, this Flecknoe. This aged prince, now flourishing in peace, and blessed with issue of a large increase, worn out with business, did at length debate to settle the succession of the state. And pondering which of all his sons was fit to reign, and wage immortal war with wit, cried, "'Tis resolved, for nature pleads that he should only rule who most resembles me. Shadwell alone my perfect image bears, mature in dullness from his tender years." The great successor of dullness to rule over the realms of nonsense is Shadwell. He compares Shadwell's defining characteristic, that is dullness, in the same terms that an epic poet might celebrate the virtues of a hero like Odysseus or Achilles. This creates this humorous twist by presenting a negative quality as a humorous virtue, and that's what's meant by the mock epic style. See how this continues, this is utterly savage. Shadwell alone of all my sons is he who stands confirmed in full stupidity. The rest to some fate meaning make pretense, but Shadwell never deviates into sense. Some beams of wit on other souls may fall, strike through and make a lucid interval, but Shadwell's genuine night admits no ray. His rising fogs prevail upon the day, and seems designed for thoughtless majesty, thoughtless as monarch oaks that shade the plain, and spread in solemn state supinely reign. Heywood and Shirley were all but types of thee, thou last great prophet of tautology. there's two things here, typology and tautology. You know from my second lecture on how English poets read the Bible that the way the Old Testament and the New Testament work is on this reliance of types. The Old Testament is full of figures that prefigure or foreshadow Christ. Figures like Moses the prophet or David the king were but shadows of Christ. And so in this, he's throwing shade at Haywood and Shirley, previous dramatists who were but knaves of dullness compared to the great dullness of Shadwell. And also tautology, that is just the saying of one thing twice in different words, generally considered to be a fault of style. So if I were to say that tautology means repeating the same thing over and over again, my definition is a tautology, because what I should say is tautology means repeating the same thing. To add over and over again is a tautology. Okay. Even I, Richard Flecknoe speaking, even I, a dunce of more renown than they, was sent before but to prepare the way, and coarsely clad in Norwich drugget came to teach the nations in thy greater name. Now, a New Testament image here. So he's not totally abandoning New Testament allusion. Figure of John the Baptist, a voice crying in the wilderness, preparing the way for the Messiah to come. Here Shadwell is seen to be the Messiah of dullness, the incarnation of dullness, and Flecknoe being the mere prophet to herald his way. In a way, he's the anti-logos. Logos meaning sense, also the word for Christ in St. John's Gospel. So the anti-logos, kind of an anti-Christ, is dullness himself, this Shadwell. And then these last few lines I'll just read. My warbling lute, the lute I whilom strung when to King John of Portugal I sung, was but the prelude to that glorious day, when thou on silver Thames didst cut thy way, with well-timed oars above the royal barge, swelled with the pride of thy celestial charge, and big with him, commander of the host, the like was ne'er in Epsom blankets tossed. Methinks I see the new Arion sail, the lute still trembling underneath thy nail. At thy well-sharpened thumb, from shore to shore, the tremble squeaks for fear the basses roar. Echoes from Pissing Alley Shadwell call, and Shadwell they resound from Ashton Hall. About thy boat the little fishes throng, as at the morning toast that floats along. Morning toast was a euphemism for feces in the river. Anyway, let's talk about this more broadly. This is an example of the satirical mode, and I had a student once say, I don't really like the 18th century because they're all so mean and vitriolic. And there is a lot of vitriol, of course, in the 18th century, in satire like this, but it's for good purpose. It's not for the sake of mean-spiritedness, and that's something you can lose sight of when reading something like Flecknoe. The poets of the Augustan Age were at war for the heart and soul of England, and this war was fought not upon the fields like the Civil War before, but within the minds of readers. They believed, and this is key to understanding why they wrote the way they wrote, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, many others believed that if language was debased, culture would be debased. If bad poetry was championed as good, then wrong would be championed as right. They believed that if they could refine English letters, then they could refine the English mind. And it's important when you read these poets from this period to understand this. These are not the romantics that we'll see next week, rhapsodizing privately upon flowers in the forest. These are preachers in the public square, and their gospel was good sense. Johnson, in his Life of Dryden, has this quotation that I'd like to share. This is talking about Dryden. Before we move on to Pope, I just want to read you this. There was therefore, before the time of Dryden, no poetical diction, No system of words at once refined from the grossness of domestic use and free from the harshness of terms appropriated to particular arts. Words too familiar or too remote defeat the purpose of a poet. From those sounds which we hear on small or on coarse occasions, we do not easily receive strong impressions or delightful images. The words to which we are nearly strangers, whenever they occur, draw attention on themselves, which they should transmit to things. Those happy combinations of words which distinguish poetry from prose had been rarely attempted. We had few elegances or flowers of speech. The roses had not yet been plucked from the bramble, or different colors had not been joined to enliven one another. This is a great example of not only what Johnson thought of Dryden, which contains some pretty incredibly strong statements in this excerpt, but also the kind of principles that Johnson and his age held in the 18th century. And these principles, of course, were informed by um, the Augustan Age. So before we move on to the age of Dryden, let's move from the late 17th century with John Dryden to the early 18th century with Alexander Pope. Samuel Johnson said of Pope that no authors had ever so much fame in their own lifetime as Pope and Voltaire. And if ever you're reading 17th century or 18th century poets, check and see if Johnson wrote a life on that poet. Johnson's lives are good guides to not just 18th century principles and valuations of poetry, but also on the poets themselves. So Alexander Pope, really a successor to John Dryden. Geoffrey Tillotson, 20th century critic on the 18th century, fantastic, by the way, has an excellent anthology on 18th century criticism. Geoffrey Tillotson said, anthology on 18th century literature, not just criticism. But Tillotson said that Pope looked back to Dryden, just as Dryden looked back to Waller. So we see this chain here. And Alexander Pope was quite conscious of his place in English poetry. And this is from the first epistle of the second book of Horace, Imitated, in which he's talking about his own place in history and how he sees the progress of poetry. He says, "Wit grew polite, and numbers learned to flow. Waller was smooth, but Dryden taught to join the varying verse, the full resounding line, the long majestic march, and energy divine. Though still some traces of our rustic vein and splay-foot verse remained, and will remain. Late, very late, correctness grew our care, when the tired nation breathed from civil war." Correctness, key here. We get a keen sense of Pope's awareness of his own place within poetry and his mission to refine English poetry. You also get this idea of correctness, and there's hardly a more correct poet than Pope. Let me read you. He perfected the couplet, by the way. They are much more concise, much more distilled than John Dryden's. John Dryden often had a triplet in his heroic verse, where you have 3 rhymes of iambic pentameter on the end, where he often found that he could not turn easily in a couplet. He would add the triplet, and sometimes the last line of the triplet was an Alexandrine, meaning it contained an extra foot of hexameter. Well, Pope, you don't find that. He has no problem turning in his verse. This is from an essay on criticism, which is really sound advice for any reader. This is just delightful. So witty, so Pope. "A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep, or taste not the Pierian spring. There shallow thoughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again." Drink deep, drink largely, he's saying. This idea that when you start out on learning a new subject, There's often this moment of intoxication where you suddenly feel like you've mastered it when really you've only read a couple books. You must drink deep. It's the opposite of spirits and liquor. You must drink deep to be sober. It's very similar to Francis Bacon's principle in his essay on atheism, where he says that a little philosophy inclines men's minds towards atheism. Whereas the more you first read philosophy, it does incline that way, but more and more reading sends you back towards theism. Um, kind of Bacon is behind this statement, also Quintilian. Fired at first sight with what the Muses imparts, in fearless youth we tempt the height of arts, while from the bounded level of our mind short views we take, nor see the lengths behind. But more advanced, behold with strange surprise new distant scenes of endless science rise. So pleased at first the towering Alps we try, mount o'er the vales, and seem to tread the sky. The eternal snows appear already past, and the first clouds and mountains seem the last. But those attained, we tremble to survey the growing labors of the lengthened way. The increasing prospect tires our wondering eyes. Hills peep o'er hills, and Alps on Alps arise. Here's a really good advice for readers. A perfect judge will read each work of wit with the same spirit that its author writ. Survey the whole, nor seek slight faults to find where nature moves and rapture warms the mind, nor lose, for that malignant dull delight, the generous pleasure to be charmed with wit. But in such lays as neither ebb nor flow, correctly cold and regularly low, that shunning faults one quiet tenor keep, we cannot blame indeed, but we may sleep. This idea of the poet as teacher here. You see this here, that poetry, we often think of poetry, thanks to the Romantics, as a mode of self-expression, as a way to express oneself, and it certainly is. But during this period, there's not this conception of that. Poetry now is a public mode of rhetoric. As a member of society, the poet is, and not apart from it. This means that poetry is not merely nice, polite entertainment, nor a means of diversion, but something urgent and social. It values the public and normal over the private and singular. It aims to refine the reader's tastes. So again, these couplets, highly concentrated meaning. I mean, it's so difficult to write like Pope wrote. Sense distilled into its purest form. There's something invigorating about reading Pope. You can't skim his poetry, mainly because there's no excess on the top to skim. This isn't milk. This is like a distilled whiskey that one must take straight and in measured quantities. No one wrote better couplets than Pope. And Ezra Pound said this to Eliot. In T.S. Eliot's first draft of The Wasteland, the section on the fire sermon, Eliot had a tribute to Pope. Eliot always loved Pope, and so he wrote these heroic couplets in the fire sermon. Sent the draft to Ezra Pound, and Pound wrote back, "Pope has done this so well that you cannot do it better. And if you mean this as a burlesque, you had better suppress it, for you cannot parody Pope unless you can write better verse than Pope, and you can't." And so the heroic couplets were removed. They don't appear in Eliot's in Eliot's published form of The Wasteland. There's never been a more concise and expert poet of the couplet since Pope. So in our last few moments, the last section of this lecture, let's turn from the early 18th century Alexander Pope to the mid-18th century, often called the Age of Johnson. Now, Samuel Johnson is a literary giant. His fame rests more on his contributions as a biographer, as an essayist, as a lexicographer, than as a poet. But his poetry does hold some significance and reflects certain characteristics worth exploring. So I want to read the last few lines of his poem, The Vanity of Human Wishes. This is a poem that's exploring the human condition. And ever since the Augustan Age, you have this interest in anthropology. Poets are interested in the human condition and how to find happiness. What does it mean to be human? What are humans like? John Milton's Paradise Lost, an Augustan Age poem, is an exercise in this question. Thinking about the whole history and mythology of humankind, how do I place it into a poem that explains who we are today? That's one way to read Paradise Lost. John Wilmot's A Satire Against Mankind, a great Restoration Age poet. It's a pretty bitter view, a pretty pessimistic view of human nature. Pope's Essay on Man is another really good one, all focusing on the fragility and brevity of human life and human knowledge. Well, Johnson's The Vanity of Human Wishes participates in this conversation. At the end of his exploration, he concludes, "Where then shall hope and fear their objects find? Must dull suspense corrupt the stagnant mind? Must helpless man, in ignorance sedate, roll darkling down the torrent of his fate? Must no dislike alarm, no wishes rise, no cries attempt the mercies of the skies?" Here we have the introduction of the Johnsonian voice addressing these questions. "Inquirer, cease. Petitions yet remain, which heaven may hear, nor deem religion vain. Still raise for good the supplicating voice, but leave to heaven the measure and the choice. Safe in his power, whose eyes discern afar the secret ambush of a specious prayer. Implore his aid, in his decisions rest. Secure whate'er he gives the best. Yet, when the sense of sacred presence fires, and strong devotion to the skies aspires, pour forth thy fervors for a healthful mind, obedient passions, and a will resigned. For love, which scarce collective man can fill, for patience, sovereign or transmuted ill. For faith, that panting for a happier seat, counts death kind nature's signal of retreat. These goods for man the laws of heaven ordain, these goods he grants who grants the power to gain. With these celestial wisdom calms the mind, and makes the happiness she does not find." This is so characteristic of 18th century piety, of 18th century anthropology, and the masterful control of 18th century form, poetic form. Sanity, order, chaste feeling, the subdued will, a mind that looks to celestial wisdom, not happiness, as the fulfillment of a human life well lived. Johnson's poems are known for his intellectual weight. He often incorporates mythology, history, some theology sometimes, and philosophy. And this, in a way, allows him to participate and further the trends established, the normative trends established by the Augustan Age. He also carries it forward in interesting ways that sometimes seem to suggest or prefigure certain romantic sensibilities, and this is something that we find in the age of Johnson. Not so much with Johnson's verse, although it's there, but in some other poets like Collins and Gray. Now, I want to conclude before we end this lecture by looking ahead to our next lecture, by identifying a turn towards romantic sensibility. There is a swerve towards it long before the Romantic poets even begin writing. Mid to late 18th century poetry serves as a bridge between this earlier Augustan neoclassical style and the emerging Romantic movement. These poems explore reason and order, but they also hint at the growing emphasis on emotion and imagination that would define Romanticism. And what characterizes this is a shift in looking at the models. In the 18th century, you have poets who are no longer looking to ancient Rome for models of sanity, but who begin to look at Milton, Anne Finch, Thomas Gray, Collins. These are all a part of these poets. I just want to read you the first stanza of Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, rather the first quatrain, because this was first published not in stanzas, but with intervals, but in quatrains, rhyming quatrains. The curfew tolls, the knell, parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. We see a lyrical voice that is intensely private, of a figure withdrawn from the rhythms of rural work and society, who is an observer, a meditative onlooker, one who is isolated. We have the return of pastoral mode, which is simultaneously at home within the Augustan Age and neoclassical poetry, but also in the rural musings of the Romantic era poets. This poem was published in 1751. It's a good 20 years before Wordsworth was born. And you can see in the longer close reading I have on this channel of this poem, where I go through and I talk about the Miltonic mode and this lean towards Romanticism. And you can find that on this channel. But scholars used to call this style of 18th century poetry, this turn, Pre-Romanticism or Pre-Romantic poetry. The term fell out of favor as scholars claimed that it placed a teleological bias upon mid-18th century poets who would not have considered themselves as pre-romantics. However, for our purposes in this survey, I find it useful. The goal of these survey lectures is, of course, to show how the progress of English poetry develops in conversation with history, politics, religion, and other movements of literature, and how these often too easy designation of literary movements, such as the age of the Augustan era poetry, the age of Johnson, Romanticism, how these literary moments overlap and spill over into new movements. So we're going to see this when we return to Romanticism next week. So for everyone on YouTube, thanks for watching, and until next time.